name's Dan Halliday. I'm a philosopher. It's my job to try and come up with answers to the hardest questions about ethics. In this series, we're going to look beyond our everyday assertions about right and wrong. Instead, we're going to try and think through an ethical position so that we can find out how to defend our actions. We're going to meet lots of other philosophers. They're going to have different and often conflicting views about which actions are right and which are wrong. Most importantly, we'll see how ethics matters right now in your life and mine. We're going to grapple with some of the trickiest ethical questions that get thrust at us in the first part of the 21st century. When making moral judgments, most of us rely on common sense. We go with our gut feeling. We draw on these intuitions and principles that just seem right. And these guide us through what are therefore the easy cases. I asked Peter Singer to tell me more about common sense morality.
Essentially, this is the view that we all have moral intuitions that guide us as to how to act. You could think of it as our conscience. There was a view that, well, everybody really knows the difference between right and wrong. They just have to listen to their conscience. Sometimes their conscience will get corrupted. And then they would say, and there's this body of moral principles which we all know about, which makes up common sense morality. So it would be things like honesty, telling the truth, gratitude, for example, repaying favours to those who do things to you, benevolence, generally being kind to people, but perhaps in proportion to their closeness to you. So family obligations come first, obligations to strangers lag a good way behind. And of course, the rules about not injuring, not maiming, not killing.
Not killing seems like an ethical judgment. Our intuitions express our deep feelings about what's right and what's wrong. But how do we decide what to do when it's not intuitively obvious? Maybe we need a theory that we can apply consistently to all problems, even the really complex ones. Consequentialism is one such theory. And Peter Singer is without doubt the most famous living consequentialist. I got him to explain to me exactly what consequentialism is.
Consequentialism is the view that the right action is the one that has the best consequences. And utilitarianism is the view that by the best consequences, we mean the best consequences for the well-being of all of those affected. The classical utilitarians, people like Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, they talked about happiness and pleasure and pain. Happiness and misery, pleasure and pain. That's what they meant by well-being, and that's still, I think, a reasonable account of well-being. Utilitarians basically say the right thing to do is the action that will do most to increase the surplus of happiness over misery for all of those affected.
In the abstract, it sounds quite intuitive that right action is about bringing about the best results. Who would disagree with that? Trouble is, consequentialism ends up having some quite troubling implications in certain cases. A good way to test what consequentialism implies is through the famous trolley problem.
The trolley problem deals with a runaway trolley or a train, we can say, coming down the tracks. And in the first case, there are 5 people on the line that the train is heading for. And the only thing you can do to save them from being hit and killed by the train is to divert it to a side track where there's one person. About 80% of people say, you should divert the train down the side track because only one person will be killed. And it's better that only one person is killed rather than 5 are killed. Then you change the example slightly so that there's no side track, but there's a footbridge over the train line. And standing on the footbridge, there's this very heavy person. And he's leaning over to look at the train hurtling down the track, which again will kill 5 people. And you know that if you give him a nudge, he would fall in front of the train, and because he's so big and heavy, he would stop the train and save the 5 people, but he would be killed. And you can't commit suicide yourself because you're quite light and you wouldn't be enough to stop the train, let's say. So when you ask people, would you push this heavy person onto the track, most of them say no, that would be wrong. In both cases, you're bringing about the death of 1 to save 5. What's the difference? Well, Josh Green at Harvard, who's a psychologist, has asked people what they think about these problems when their brains are being imaged. Green's done a lot of other experiments on this, and his hypothesis is that we have an evolutionary inherited response to using physical violence to push someone to their death. And of course, it's reasonable and good that we should have that response. But it's not a justification for saying, yes, it is wrong in that case, but right in the switch case, in the case where you can just pull a switch. And of course, we have no evolved response to pulling a switch because switches didn't play a role for most of our evolutionary history. So I think sometimes you can explain away these intuitive responses and show that, yeah, we understand why we have them, but they don't really carry moral weight.
So, our intuitive repugnance at throwing people in front of trams might be the expression of an evolved psychological response to violence. But if this is true, does it show that consequentialism is still a good ethical theory after all, even when it comes to killing people? I asked Caroline West, who's a consequentialist, if she would push the man.
I think it would be right, yes. I think I ought to do it. If I was really sure, those are really the outcomes, yeah. Well, I think there are actually good consequentialist arguments for why many of us shouldn't be able to motivate ourselves too easily to kill one to save five, because people who have that sort of character are more likely to kill people, and in general, killing people doesn't have good consequences. For ordinary people, there are good consequentialist reasons why we should make ourselves the sort of people who can't perhaps psychologically kill one to save five.
Caroline West thinks that it's right to pull the switch or push the guy off the bridge, and that she ought to do it. But she doubts that she could or should muster the kind of motivation to go through with that. Another problem is that consequences are generally very difficult to fully determine. Killing one to save five is just one of a whole load of consequences that result from that particular action. I got Peter Singer to talk me through this problem a bit.
Morality is a socially complex phenomenon, and even for a utilitarian, it's very complicated to work out, in many cases, what is the right thing to do. It's not simply, oh, is it better that one person die rather than five people die, to which the answer is simple, and I think is yes. But it's also, what is the effect of telling people that it's sometimes okay to push other people to their death? How is that going to affect society? Are people going to be sophisticated enough to work out the cases in which it is justified to push someone to their death, as against the obviously overwhelming majority of cases in which that's wrong? And so you can have questions about what would you do, what would be the right thing to do in a hypothetical circumstance where we've set out what the consequences are and we've specified that there's no further spillover effects. That's one thing, and I think sometimes that is simple if you've been told what the consequences are. But it's another thing to say, what kind of moral code should we educate our children in? What kind of moral code should we promote? When should we criticise people for not acting in accordance with certain moral rules? Those are complicated questions, and so I think that's when people say, oh, utilitarians are simple-minded, it's hubris to think you can solve these moral problems. I think people are mixing up these different kinds of questions, some of which are genuinely difficult and complicated, and others are not.
OK, so maybe consequentialism doesn't imply that I should just go around harming innocent people for the sake of benefiting other people. But what about me? Consequentialism also seems to imply that I shouldn't be putting myself first. After all, there's nothing special about my well-being when it comes to the total amount of well-being that exists. I may need to do less for myself and more to help others who are in greater need. And this is bound to require massive lifestyle changes. Is this asking a bit too much?
Consequentialism seems to be more demanding of us, morally speaking, than common sense morality says. I mean, even if you take into account the very, I think, valid points that consequentialists have made about how if people really think that they've got to give and give and give until giving 1 cent more would make them worse off than the person they're trying to help. You know, that kind of view, a lot of consequentialists think, you know, is... If people really took that thought seriously, they would just give up and stop trying to do anything at all. It's just too overwhelming, the scale of the task. So a lot of consequentialists think people should give as much as they psychologically can give, consistent with, you know, being motivated to keep on giving. And, but I think that suggests that we should probably, most of us, give more to others in need than we currently do. So I think there are some places where consequentialist view will challenge aspects of common sense morality, but many aspects of common sense morality, like keep your promises, don't tell lies, don't kill innocent people, where consequentialism will support using those rules.
We all like to rely on our intuitions about what's right and what's wrong, and a lot of the time they do get us through. But we've all been in situations where we're just not sure what the right action is. And we can all remember times where we've disagreed with someone else who's got a different sense of right and wrong. To get past this problem, we need to develop ethical theories. They might preserve some of our deepest intuitions, but their purpose is to help us grapple with the really hard questions. Can consequentialism moderate our intuitive sense of right and wrong, or should intuition always override? Should we push the guy off the bridge? What do you think?
Next time.
I have a right not to be killed, no matter the consequences.